So while we're talking about data regulation, first of all, I want to clarify that there are actually many types of data regulations in the world. Many of you probably are aware of data regulations related to privacy or security. For example, the European Union had a data protection directive in 1995, which has evolved into the General Data Protection Regulation effective 2018. In the US, we don't have a federal law governing privacy in all industries, but different states have adopted different regulations, and some industries have adopted industry-specific regulations as well. For example, California Consumer Privacy Act was effective starting 2020, and Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, in the shorthand, HIPAA, has been passed in 1996. So both laws are trying to govern privacy and security issues, but it's specific to users in a particular state or in particular industries such as healthcare. I know in Japan, there are also at least one act on the protection of personal information, which was put in place in 2003 and has been updated in 2017. So those are just a few examples of data regulations about privacy and security. Many other countries have similar laws. In addition to that, we also observe data regulations about data localization. For example, in Russia, 2003, and they had the law called Personal Data Law, and it's amended in 2015 and has a clause about localized data. In China, they have just passed a data security law this year, emphasizing localization of, quote, important data. In India, there has been some dated laws like Company Act or Payment and Settlement System Act, basically require local storage of payment-related data. So that's about regulations in localization of data. There has also been some regulation about data sharing, or more generally, the usage of data. As early as 1970, US has Fair Credit Reporting Act, talking about how credit collection agencies can collect, use credit-related individual data. In UK, effective 2018, there's Open Banking Initiative that's basically set up a standard for financial sectors, especially banks, to share their user data with fintech and other third-party users. So this is the overall landscape about data regulation. Today, I want to share with you some literature about the European Union's General Data Privacy Regulation. This is a very general regulation. It's a landmark regulation. It started in 2016, is elected in 2016 and took effect in May of 2018. So the main clauses in this regulation is to protect data subjects' rights. For example, it's specified that European citizens have the right to access copy of personal identifiable information. They have the right to know data breaches. They have the right to request a provider to delete their historical data. They have the right to basically download their personal identifiable data and take it to another service provider. It also requires the service provider to provide granular informed opt-in consent options so that subjects can choose to give their data exclusively. And this has to be freely given, in the sense that even if the users decide not to give the consent, the user can still use the basic function of the service. So that's the part of the regulation focusing on the data subjects' rights. It also have a part of the regulation focused on how the service providers should comply to protect consumer privacy. For example, it has this concept of privacy by design. All the data management, auditing, classification, risk identification, and mitigation should all have privacy in mind when the service provider is designing the system. If the service provider has more than 250 employees or is heavy in data use, the service provider is required to train or hire qualified staff, for example, in data protection officer. Violators could face penalty up to 23 million US dollars or 4% of the company's annual and global revenue. So more importantly, this law, although it's covering all member states of European Union, the enforcement is subject to each member state of EU. At the 2-year-old of this regulation, the European Commission has issued a report evaluating the impact of this regulation. They find that GDPR is a pillar of citizens' empowerment. It provides global reference point. Many countries are considering similar regulations, if not already adopt similar regulations. There's a high public awareness, but the use of data portability is low. And the report emphasized that further progress is needed to make the handling of cross-border cases more efficient and more harmonized across European Union. And it's acknowledged that it's challenging to apply GDPR to small and medium-sized enterprises. So that's the official evaluation of this regulation. I want to share with you some academic literature about the effects of GDPR. Before doing that, let's take a look of what's the potential pros and cons of this regulation. On the pros side, we know this regulation gives consumers the option and tool to block data collection, to delete collected data, to save or port personal data. So that could be very helpful for consumers, especially those quite aware of privacy and other data-related issues. It provides transparency on data use and data breach to consumers. It promotes data security measures. So with all these regulations, it could potentially reduce unauthorized data use. It could reduce data breach, identity theft, cyberbullying, and other bad actions that could hurt consumers. So that's the potential benefits of this regulation. On the potential cost side, we observe that the regulation imposes significant compliance costs, especially on small or young enterprises. It has the potential to reduce advertising effectiveness and therefore reduce companies' ability to monetize on data. They may discourage investment in existing and new businesses, especially for data-intensive and business-to-consumer firms. It has the risk of reducing future innovations. It also has the potential to strengthen market concentration and reduce competition, partly because consumers may be more willing to limit data sharing to large incumbent firms that they already patronize, but very reluctant to share data with new entities. And large platforms may be able to redefine the GDPR compliance policy in their own ecosystem, while the small players have to follow those policies. And that could give advantage to the large platforms. And also the large incumbents could use the GDPR as an excuse to resist data sharing or data interoperability with other players, especially competitors. So that's the potential benefits and costs of this GDPR. So let me share with you about the literature, really how much of this list has been realized in reality. So this is a survey. It's actually a survey conducted by PwC before GDPR became effective. So the survey was conducted in 2017. So what they find at that point is a majority of US organizations, as large as 92%, have taken GDPR compliance as the top data protection priority. And many surveyed companies, for example, 68% of them plan to allocate $1 to $10 million just to be complied with GDPR, and 9% even plan to allocate more than $10 million for GDPR compliance. So this is a survey before the implementation of GDPR. What happened afterwards? 1 year after GDPR became effective, Bloomberg has conducted a survey. So this is a survey results showing that many businesses find it's quite challenging for GDPR implementation in terms of integration or complex requirement, the budget and resources required for the compliance, the time to implement the compliance technology, and there are also challenges in third-party awareness or third-party commitment, organizational awareness, and so forth. So you can see that the compliance with this regulation has presented a lot of challenges to a lot of businesses. And some examples, just to give you some sense, Microsoft has said that they have dedicated over 1,600 engineers to GDPR projects. Google has argued that they spend hundreds of years of human time to comply with GDPR. According to the International Association of Privacy Professionals, they find that over 500K European Union organizations have registered data protection officers to be compliant with GDPR. Given the average salary of data protection officer is about 88,000 US dollars per year, this means substantial costs just to be compliant with GDPR on this particular article. And the Bloomberg survey also asked about companies in terms of how would you rate your organization's compliance with the GDPR? Remember, this is already 1 year into the regulation. Only 44% of the respondents report that they believe they are fully compliant, while 51% said that they're only partially compliant. So you can see that compliance is quite uneven here. And there's also a question, do you feel your organization is ready for GDPR inspection? And about 41% said yes, while the remaining are either no or don't know or not sure. So again, the readiness for GDPR seems uneven as well. So that's on the compliance cost side. In terms of enforcement, I think the enforcement, especially the high fine enforcement, have sped up over the recent 2 years. I'm giving you the top 10 enforcement cases according to enforcementtracker.com for GDPR enforcement. And you can see on this list, only Google was enforced with 50 million euro in 2019. All the other 9 enforcement cases was higher amount were enforced in 2020 and 2021. So it seems like the high profile cases have been more recent. And let me share with you some research we have done about the impact of GDPR on venture investment. This is based on our published article on marketing science and on some on a journal called Antitrust Source. So I will give you the exact citation at the end of this presentation. If you're interested, you're welcome to check out the studies. So our study is based on the data of venture investment deals from 2014 to 2020. These data are collected by Crunchbase and Venture Expert. And we compared EU-based technology ventures versus the US-based technology ventures. So this graph is showing that the blue line is for the US deals. The dashed red line is for EU venture deals. You can see that the 2 lines are sort of roughly parallel up to the rollout of GDPR, which is in May of 2018. And after that, you can see the distance between US and EU has been somewhat enlarged, implying that the GDPR may have a negative impact on EU-based technology ventures. If we try to estimate this impact, we estimate that in 3 periods, the period between the enactment and rollout, the first year after rollout, and the second half of our post-data period. What we find is that if we look at just between enactment and rollout, the effect is statistically 0. So there's not seem to be much effect between the enactment and rollout as compared to before the enactment. However, in the first period of rollout, we find the effect is significant. It's almost negative 32%. So this is in the reduction of number of deals in EU-based tech ventures. In the second rollout period, that negative effect still exists, but of smaller amount, roughly 11%. So that's the overall effect. If we try to decompose this into ventures that's more data related versus less data related, we find the ventures that's more data related suffer more after the GDPR. So they have less number of deals for EU-based ventures. If we look at the difference between B2C ventures versus B2B ventures, the effect is more negative for B2C ventures. And if we look at early stage ventures versus main stage ventures, the early stage ventures suffer more. So this is consistent with the fact that the GDPR is basically regulating on data-related ventures, and the data could be more relevant for the business if the data is collected from individual consumers rather than businesses. So that's why the B2C ventures suffer more from this effect, while the more data-related ventures also suffer more. So if we look at across industries, we look at health ventures, financial ventures, and IT-related ventures. You can see that all three actually have some negative impact after GDPR, but the effect is slightly bigger for the IT section. And in another paper, we look at domestic versus foreign investors, how they respond to GDPR. We find that the investors from US and other non-EU investors respond more negatively to GDPR as compared to EU-only investors. So that means the foreign investors, the investors that are not located in the EU states, are more reluctant to give money for an EU-based technology ventures after GDPR. And we also find, again, the bigger effects concentrate on data-reliant ventures, on new ventures, on B2C ventures, and on investment that's more related to the first round of venture investment. So that's the effect of GDPR on venture investment. A number of other researchers have a look at effects of GDPR on advertising. For example, this paper by Goldberger, Johnson, and Shriver find that GDPR leads to about 12% drop in EU user website page views and website e-commerce revenue. And similarly, in another paper, they find that GDPR has led to about 12% drop in observable consumers by an online travel intermediary. There's sort of some interesting finding is that they also find the consumers that allow themselves to be tracked by this online travel intermediaries. They're able to track such consumers for a longer time, and those consumers' data are actually have increased the value. And this increased value has offset the ad revenue losses from those consumers that opt out because of GDPR. So we see a mixed message here. And another paper by Johnson, Goldberger, and Shriver also find that GDPR actually increased the market concentration of web technology vendors. And they find this is driven by the web technology vendors' choice rather than consumer consent. And you may wonder about what's the impact of GDPR on innovations. This paper looked at effects of GDPR on innovations in terms of online apps. So they look at Google Play Store from 2016 to 2019. The graph I'm showing you here is the number of apps in Google Play Store over time from 2016 to 2019. And the vertical line here is the implementation of GDPR. So you can see here the number of apps have dropped dramatically after the implementation of GDPR, and the drop is about 1/3. So they find about 1/3 apps exited post GDPR, and the entries after GDPR is also less than 1/2 as compared to the pre-GDPR entries. So both the exits and the reduced entries has contributed to the reduction of consumer surplus by about 32% and the reduction of aggregate app use by about 26%. So in summary, what we find is, or I should say the literature has found that GDPR triggered very high compliance cost for all types of businesses, and the compliance has been uneven 1 year after it took effect. And GDPR has shown large and broad impact on tech venture investment, and part of this negative effect still persists 2.5 years post the rollout of GDPR. We find GDPR has a large significant negative effect on app innovations, which in my opinion is kind of alarming. And we also find GDPR has significant negative effects on trackable data for advertising, but its impact on advertising revenue could be partially offset by better quality of trackable data. And all these findings tends to focus on the cost side of GDPR as a regulation. Definitely more research is needed for the effects on the benefits of consumer privacy protection, on the reduction of data-related risk. And these are the intended consequence of GDPR. We really want research to show whether those intention has been realized in reality. And once we have the evidence on the benefit side and on the cost side, we can look at the trade-off between positive and negative effects. And this trade-off arguably is very important for Japan and other countries to consider similar or different data regulations, and it could be could have very profound impact in reshaping the future landscape of competition, innovation, and economic development. So that's basically all I have here. And here's the list of all the studies I have cited. I welcome any comments or suggestions and questions. Thank you very much.